Tonight, in celebration of Black History Month, Dr. Ervin will speak about her new book, Gateway to Equality, Black Women and the Struggle for Economic Justice in St. Louis, in which she investigates the struggle for economic justice of working-class Black women, from the rise of New Deal liberalism in the 1930s to the social upheavals of the 1960s. Like most of the nation during the 1930s, St. Louis was caught in the stifling grip of the Great Depression, and for the next 30 years continued to experience significant urban decline as its population swelled and the area's industries stagnated. Through these decades, many Black citizens found themselves struggling financially and fighting for access to profitable jobs and suitable working conditions. To combat ingrained racism, crippling levels of poverty, and substandard living conditions, Black women worked together to form a community-based culture of resistance, fighting for employment, a living wage, dignity, representation, and political leadership. Ervin will present an account of the ways in which Black working-class women creatively fused racial and economic justice, shedding light on an unexplored aspect of community activism and the complexities of the overlapping civil rights and labor movements during the first half of the 20th century. St. Louis native Keona Ervin is assistant professor of African American history and faculty affiliate in the Department of Black Studies at the University of Missouri. After earning a BA at Duke University, she completed her master's degree in doctoral study at Washington University in St. Louis, where she earned a PhD in history. Prior to joining the MU faculty, Ervin was a fellow and lecturer in gender, sexuality, and women's studies and history at Malone College in Brunswick, Maine, and assistant professor of history and Africana studies at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. Her current research interests include Black freedom movement studies, urban history, Black women's history, and U.S. labor and working class history. So join me in welcoming Dr. Keona Ervin to the Secretary of State's office in the Missouri State Library.
Good evening, everyone. Many thanks to Vicki Myers for the introduction. Thanks to Emily Luker, to Brian Rogers, to John Dugan for extending the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. So the idea for my research originated in a series of conversations with labor and civil rights activist Ora Lee Malone, who graciously agreed to share her life's work with a graduate student furiously searching for a research topic. Listening to and recording her reflections about Jim Crow life in the Deep South and its connection to Jim Crow in the urban Midwest, I came to appreciate a narrative of the Black freedom movement that eschewed near exclusive focus on voting, desegregation, and charismatic Black religious and secular male leaders. Malone's St. Louis narrative, which stretched from the time that she migrated to St. Louis in 1951 all the way to the 1980s, when she officially retired, was one of trade unionism, the struggle for decent, full, and fair employment, a defense of public institutions, and women's political leadership and voice within grassroots organizations and informal politics. Born in 1918 in segregated Brooksville, Mississippi, Malone later moved to Mobile, Alabama, where she joined the campaign for voting rights during the 1940s. As a participant in the Alabama civil rights movement in her late 20s, she campaigned against the Boswell Amendment, passed by the state legislature in 1945 and ratified the following year. This allowed registrars to disqualify aspiring African American voters who failed to satisfactorily interpret the US Constitution. Such measures were swift and effective in disenfranchising Black voters. And in response, the Birmingham and Mobile chapters of the NAACP, as well as the Voters and Veterans League, which was a Black Mobile-based group working to protect the right of African Americans to vote, filed a lawsuit in 1948. And a year later, the federal district court deemed the amendment unconstitutional on the grounds that it violated the 15th Amendment. And the success of this post-World War II campaign bolstered Malone's belief in the efficacy of collective effort. A devotee of A. Philip Randolph, she shared his commitment to define Black freedom in the terms defined by the interests of the working class, of the Black working class. After approximately 5 years of working as a peacetime worker at the California Manufacturing Company, which was a producer of men's apparel, Malone and her colleagues unionized with the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union. A shop steward and business representative for the union, she supported drives in St. Louis and in southern Missouri, and she organized St. Louis's first multiracial women's labor conference in the early 1970s. About 400 gatherers discussed ways to organize those left out of the House of Labor, and they also discussed ways to kind of build avenues for political leadership, for women in particular, and especially for women seeking to gain kind of access to leadership roles within unions across the city. A founding member of local chapters of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, the A. Philip Randolph Institute, the Women's Political Caucus, and the Coalition of Labor Union Women, and as chairs of the Coalition Against Apartheid, Malone was awarded the Martin Luther King Jr. Award in 1978 to basically honor her work in helping to build this local labor movement. She would also gain wide recognition and respect from her colleagues because of the ways that she understood unionism as a kind of community-based, women-centered, egalitarian, and social democratic kind of project. Her form of unionism merged women's rights, civil rights, and labor agendas and also prioritized women's voices. And this, according to one of her colleagues, often put Malone, quote, many leagues ahead of conventional practice and on the cutting edge of the struggle for economic justice for workers and the struggle for civil rights. She became known for this expansive kind of vision of unionism, which centered social causes. She once said, unions were crucial, quote, but their focus is often too narrow. They don't reach out enough. They concentrate too much on wages, hours, and working conditions, which is part of the job. But they should also be concerned about transportation and healthcare, which to most workers are really more important. So women labor activists like Malone tended to kind of eschew this narrow focus on wages to include something that really encompassed the broad array of concerns that workers had around living issues. She was described as a quiet and strong organizer, and she said women need to learn to fight the unions and make their demands heard. She says, I guarantee the management won't like you, but they will respect you. So disrupting this kind of politics as usual in terms of thinking about Black freedom struggle, she brought a kind of new way of thinking about how to advance the rights of kind of the marginalized or those who are often forgotten. And she provided a kind of alternative model for thinking about Black economic empowerment. So of course, figures like Orly Malone did not emerge in a vacuum in the city of St. Louis. The roots of her post-war explosion of citywide activism. She's of course joined by a number of African-American women who are doing very similar forms of work. The roots of this post-war explosion were rooted in the struggles of the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, when Black women workers especially waged strikes and engaged in self-activity to challenge the condition of their labors and to make space for themselves in city politics, to make themselves visible. In her recollections, for example, Malone would suggest that 1970s women labor organizers were actually inspired by and drew knowledge from the stories of women's labor organizing all the way back in the 1930s, that this kind of provided for them a rough blueprint of maybe how to think about their own issues. And so what began kind of as a biography of Orly Malone actually transformed into a project investigating the generations that preceded her. Now Malone died not too long ago at the age of 93, having lived a long life of engaged struggle that was less a departure from and more an extension of Black women workers' dynamic labor organizing in St. Louis, or the Gateway City, during the first half of the 20th century. And there, in that kind of long history of struggle, they built a powerful case for Black women, their work, their political work, their economic work, and their indispensability to this Black freedom movement that was kind of on the rise. So my research tells a story then of the St. Louis Black Freedom Movement through the lens of Black women, essentially. What were Black women doing at the time? It addresses how, why, by what means, and at what moments Black women workers made their economic lives and survival a matter of political concern, and the difference that this insistence made on city politics. So my book argues that from the 30s through the 60s, these women and their supporters forged an expansive struggle for economic dignity that included a number of issues, including the right to jobs, the right to a living wage, the welfare rights, respectable working conditions, affordable and decent housing, state-based support and protection, unfettered access to public accommodations, and access to the consumer marketplace. Challenging and manipulating organizations that stood at the forefront of the battle to defend the economic rights of Black workers, namely some radical labor parties, the NAACP, groups like the Urban League, the March on Washington movement of the 1940s, some industrial unions, some local groups organic to St. Louis. Through these organizations, they built a kind of powerful case for their significance. So my book talks about the work of domestic workers, pecan shellers or workers in industrial agriculture, those who were unemployed or underemployed, beauty operators, clerks, defense plant workers, garment workers, public housing tenants, welfare recipients, all with the Black professional women who supported them. That together these women generated a kind of politics that really in significant ways shaped the way that the Black Freedom Movement in St. Louis defined itself, the way that it in a sense went about its work. So they put forward a kind of unique and compelling articulation, namely that to struggle for racial justice was inherently a struggle for economic justice, that these two are closely linked. So they politicized and made into a public issue the multiple labors that they performed in their families, in their community, in their neighborhood, in local organizations, certainly in the workplace, and in public spaces. They created narratives about their labor that became useful to the project of seeking racial justice. And they also, in the process, exposed the limits of some of these social justice movements, questioning whether or not they were really vehicles for this kind of social democratic project that they were seeking to build. Okay, great. So I define Black women's labor activism in kind of three ways. One, as a project to make dignity central, to make dignity tangible in their economic arrangements, in their contractual and economic arrangements. Two, to form a collective relationship with employers, and to make public and make a matter of political import their breadwinning capacities. So my work kind of discusses how these women use institutions, coalitions with various groups, multiracial coalitions, migration, testimony, everyday resistance, self-organization, to manipulate a shifting social order toward generative ends. They're mobilizing concerns about their own survival and making important kind of inroads in doing so. Perhaps the most important, I think, contribution that my book makes, and this is only becoming kind of understandable to me as I talk about the book, having finished it, is to really make visible the fact that these struggles for Black freedom are about class in some way, that they are making arguments about kind of economics, you might say. So I like to understand myself as kind of part of a group of historians across the country who are trying to show that workers of color, that women workers of color in particular, were much more than simple contributors to the story of the making of the American working class. The labor they performed, confined as they were often to menial, low-wage jobs in the 20th century, that labor became a kind of critical arena for class struggle, for the making of these political cultures that come to define how we think about social movement history in the American 20th century. So significant work is being performed. So why St. Louis? One could tell this story based on a number of cities, right? But what is significant or distinctive about the city of St. Louis? Well, simply put, the city's geographic, economic, demographic, and political landscape uniquely shaped Black working class women's economic experiences, and it incubated their economic politics. St. Louis, a border city, where Black women workers simultaneously experienced an amalgam of regionally specific economic realities. 20th century St. Louis was a veritable crossroads. The city's unevenly segregated and industrial landscape actually accentuated women's employment. Now, in the 20th century, St. Louis lacked a kind of single, large-scale industry that dominated its local economy and gendered larger cities, by contrast, of the urban Midwest as sites of male production. So meat packing and automobile manufacturing plants, steel foundries, or other so-called manly production facilities were not as in abundance as in, say, Chicago, Pittsburgh, or Detroit. By contrast, St. Louis's economy was diverse and retail-driven. Verne Callaway, an astute observer of the local kind of scene, he was an important labor and civil rights activist. He put it like this, quote, "Because of the light industrial structure of St. Louis, many have found that the city, job-wise, is a woman's town. This suggests," he went on, "in a very meaningful way, that it is easier for a Negro female to find employment in St. Louis than a Negro male. Thus, many Negro males have moved on to Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, and other heavy industry centers." Promoted as a site for the availability of inexpensive women's labor, St. Louis had a feminized, what we might call a feminized economy. Civic boosters advertised the city as a desirable location for expenditure because women workers were abundant and affordable. For example, a study published by the Industrial Bureau of the St. Louis Chamber of Commerce noted that, quote, "The character and type of female workers here are reported to be excellent, and those employed frequently perform operations which in other cities are done almost wholly by males, such as the packing and weighing of moderately heavy materials and many other jobs requiring accuracy and care." The Chamber shared that St. Louis's larger industries typically employed women at a rate of 90% during normal times, whereas in other cities, employers used not more than 75% of the female workforce. St. Louis's industrial managers had an advantage, this bureau reported, because women's industrial output was, quote, "equally well performed as men's and at a lower cost." Around the beginning of the 1930s, St. Louis ranked 7th among cities with the largest manufacturing systems. Between the post-World War I era and the Great Depression, the St. Louis economy grew, reflecting a national trend, and so-called light industrial sectors in which women worked as clothing and food processing workers, that sector grew considerably. Or to put it another way, the industries in which women worked played an important role in the growth of the St. Louis economy overall, even as that growth had slowed since the late 19th century. In St. Louis, 28% of the total number of workers over the age of 10 were women. Nationally, the figure was 22%. St. Louis was not the only city, of course, in which industry relied quite heavily on female production, but this trend certainly became a kind of defining characteristic when thinking about women's economic development, and especially the economic development of the city overall. So marginality marked all working class women's economic experiences in the St. Louis paid labor market. But that marginality had a kind of determining, at least in the 20th century, a determining racial component. So Black working class women, as in other cities across the US, worked in the most menial positions in the city, earning extremely meager wages. Since the early 20th century, according to one student of the period, Black women had made, quote, "very little industrial progress because the most desirable factory work was practically out of their reach." Another observer predicted, quote, "the Negro woman's field for some time to come will be domestic and personal service." Black working class women were largely restricted to that field, domestic service. For instance, of the total number of women workers in St. Louis's domestic and personal service industry in 1930, roughly 44% were Black, a figure far disproportionate to their percentage of the total population of St. Louis. And at the opening of the 1930s, nearly 80% of Black women in the paid labor market were domestic workers. Only 13% worked in manufacturing, confined to the highly exploitative sectors of food processing, laundry, cigar, and tobacco, and a mere 2% were in clerical occupations. Another student put it this way, quote, "No race of female wage earners works under greater difficulty or in such restricted fields." He was right. Black women worked longer, more often, and for less money. And the menial quality of such work notwithstanding, women's wages eased to a degree the financial burdens of their families. For married women, according to social scientist William A. Crossland, the quote, "The colored woman is an important factor in supplementing the family income. The colored man would often find himself financially stranded if it were not for the additional income earned by his wife." Ira D.A. Reid observed, he was a researcher for the Urban League, the National Urban League. He wrote, "The Negro woman wage earner is probably the most consistent and persistent worker in the St. Louis labor market. Neither maidenhood, wifehood, nor the widow's weeds tend to eliminate for her the necessity of work." So compounding the reality of Black women's confinement to the lowest rungs of the paid labor market was the fact of their demographic command. So just as for many other cities, the kind of destinations in the Great Migration, you might call them, Black women led this move northward to St. Louis. In the very early 20th century, the number of Black women matched and later outpaced the number of Black men, new migrants, especially those of working age. By 1930, Black women outnumbered Black men in the age bracket in which both groups were of working age. And a similar trend would continue throughout the decade and into the second half of the 20th century. So Black women workers formed the majority of the Black population here across the period that I studied. And this made them kind of hyper visible as subjects of discourses and conversations around Black working class urban life, or urban life in general, actually. Now, outpaced by the skyrocketing percentage of Black newcomers to more desirable Great Migration locations like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Detroit, the rate of increase of St. Louis's Black population was somewhat modest, from about 6% to 11% in 1930. But this shift nonetheless indicated the kind of potential for political kind of ramifications, especially as the city is kind of dealing in a more direct way with the kind of racial question that was brought on by that migration. Well, St. Louis was a crucible for women's leadership as well. So we talked a bit about the demographic kind of issues, the work kind of landscape there. But in terms of politics, women formed an important kind of visible role in the St. Louis kind of political landscape. Early civil rights struggles, those mounted roughly from the early 1930s through the late 1940s, were not only, as a group of historians put it, increasingly urban, also proletarian or worker-based or working class-based, they were often, and consequentially, women-led. Black women's working class activisms creatively merged the movement for worker rights and the movement for civil rights. Their economic politics played a critical role in the formation of a kind of what's called a working class-oriented civil rights militancy. And this affected so many organizations that had very different set of politics, in fact. So radical kind of groups that were very popular in the 1930s, like the Communist Party, but all the way to the other end, groups like the Urban League, the NAACP, groups like the Congress of Industrial Organizations, certainly to projects around mass unionization, Roosevelt's New Deal, a New Deal labor legislation, the Federal Employment Practices Commission, wartime industrial and interracial unionism. So all of these projects find, especially in St. Louis, Black women kind of helping to shape them at a local level. Now in the post-war period, these women kind of extended the battles for economic justice. In critical ways, the terrain of struggle shifts to housing especially. It had always been an issue, of course, in St. Louis, but it shifts in a rather kind of profound way in the post-war period. In critical ways, public housing activists, public housing tenants merged the fight for employment with the struggle for decent living quarters. Some Black working class women emerged as leaders of the union movement, and in doing so helped to kind of build the liberal coalitions that were crucial to the development of the civil rights movement in that period. Other key Black professional women, middle class women, served as primary allies, becoming the kind of vocal proponents of these issues too, as they helped to kind of mobilize city politics in new ways. So the post-war movement sees a kind of important connection to what's happening in the 30s and the 40s, the early 40s, I should say. So that some of the most important episodes in the racial and economic justice struggle in St. Louis featured Black women workers, that so many activists and organizers of this kind of liberal coalition behind guiding that civil rights movement, that they so deeply engaged Black women workers' economic politics, and that even locals' understanding of St. Louis as traditionally Southern, that it came by way of thinking about Black women's labor, were all reflected in the particularities of St. Louis as a city in the 20th century. Through this prism of Black women's economic hardship, for example, some spokespersons of the March on Washington movement, for instance, of the 40s, they tended to assess St. Louis's racial record in terms of the treatment of Black working class women. So one activist put it this way. He said, quote, "There is no other city in the nation than St. Louis where employment conditions are as bad for colored girls and women." So Black working class women were crucial agents in the formation of this movement, right? That centered the kind of concerns of workers, but wasn't just limited to concerns about wages, right? It was kind of thinking about the kind of totality of workers' living concerns. So it's women who are playing a kind of crucial role here. Now, if we think about St. Louis kind of in terms of civil rights history, it kind of doesn't really appear on the radar in terms of popular imagination, right? Against the backdrop of sweeping urban transformation, civil rights struggles outside the St. Louis metropolitan region actually captivated the nation. So think of cities like Montgomery, Little Rock, Birmingham, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. These cities staged some of the nation's most dramatic and far-reaching campaigns and conflicts in 20th century social movement history. From boycotts to marches, from strikes to rebellions, confrontations in these locations marked national debates about race in America. By contrast, St. Louis, though home to significant struggle, still tended to contribute to national conversations about urban decline, urban decay, entrenched racial segregation, and not militant civil rights protest. St. Louis usually fell under the radar, an outcome that was not completely unintentional. Local politicians, some business leaders and reporters tried with some relative success to conceal Black resistance, to preserve the city's reputation as an urban center above the fray of racial conflict. This is a significant point because many city leaders of the 60s, for instance, were trying to avoid the kind of urban rebellions that were happening all across the country. St. Louis was certainly a part of the conversation. So even kind of traditional models of civil rights leadership did not necessarily take hold as strongly as they did in other places. St. Louis, of course, had its kind of charismatic religious Black male leaders. It also had secular Black male leaders that figured rather prominently. But there was space for women to assert their own forms of leadership as well, not only as kind of bridge leaders, but also as formal, kind of visible architects of the St. Louis-based kind of civil rights movement. So for instance, St. Louis NAACP President Evelyn H. Roberts. Here pictured Missouri NAACP President Margaret Bush Wilson. Frankie Muse Freeman, one of the city's most important civil rights lawyers. Marion Oldham, a leader of the St. Louis Congress of Racial Equality. All of these women ranked with Verne Callaway's 30 most influential opinion makers in the St. Louis Negro community. Callaway could have added his wife to the list, Verne Callaway, who in 1962 became the first African-American woman to win a seat in the Missouri House of Representatives. All of these women, St. Louis-based, right, made key inroads in housing and employment opportunities for the city's Black working class, but also if you think about kind of the statewide, along statewide lines, for that Black working class as well. So they operated along the margins, you might say, in a city where power brokers tried to hide racial upheaval. But these women kind of experimented. There was space to experiment, and they did that to relative success. So there were spaces in St. Louis for political possibility, for these women to emerge in significant ways. Now, just a kind of personal note, as a graduate student, I had determined kind of early that St. Louis history was important, not just because I'd grown up there, right? But what I'd been studying kind of suggested that, of course. But it was important not just the kind of local history, it was important to the kind of critical questions that form the intersection of urban history and Black freedom movement studies, social movement history. And although my advisors agreed with me, and I had the support of historians and scholars, interdisciplinary scholars, who had produced terrific historical examinations of race, class, space, and space in the city. Some of them, the covers of their work are pictured there. There was still, though, a remarkable number of scholars and editors who were not so convinced. But since embarking on this project as early as 2005, this sentiment has changed rather significantly. A number of publications in recent years have convincingly demonstrated how St. Louis matters to a number of a set of overlapping questions, and my work, no doubt, kind of joins this chorus. But of course, the racial and economic history of St. Louis City and its suburbs assumed even greater interest, and I would say importance, with the Ferguson uprising of 2014. This moment catalyzed what came to be known the movement for Black lives. These sustained protests, right, really turned a kind of public lens, you might say, to historical analysis, to a sense that history had a kind of explanatory power in thinking about and helping to explain how we arrived here. So many were starting to think about or study the kind of deep roots of racialized poverty, of kind of chronic unemployment, of segregated and low-income housing, of an underfunded kind of public school system that defined Black suburban life in St. Louis, right? And also, of course, Black city life as well. So so historians you have kind of in this moment who knew the history well and were willing to kind of make sense of it to a wider public, and of course we're very grateful for that. But even kind of as this attention revealed much, the history of Black working class women's political work in the city, I think, remained much less well known, I'd say. So my book begins with a strike and it ends with a strike. So these are the kind of bookends of my investigation, you might say. The first occurred in the spring of 1933. In that year, Carrie Smith and Cora Lewis, two Black working class radical women, led a strike of 2,000 predominantly Black female industrial workers. They staged one of the most important episodes of labor militancy and economic justice struggle in the 1930s. Smith and Lewis and their followers or supporters, all nutshellers in St. Louis or East St. Louis, battled the R.E. Funston Nut Company after managers implemented severe wage cuts in the early 1930s. They were extending the unemployed rights struggle that took form in that city around the same time. Quote, "We think we are entitled to a wage that will provide us with ample food and clothing," Carrie Smith told gatherers at a hearing. Smith, who was in her early 40s, had been working for Funston for about 18 years. Overwork and financial insecurity had taken their toll. So too had the unrelenting demands of political leadership. The day before the hearing, which included company representatives, she addressed demonstrators at the conclusion of a march through downtown. The first to speak, she bore witness to Black working class women's economic suffering, summoning the broader public sphere to consider their survival. Cora Lewis, also in her early 40s, spoke at the hearing as well. She shared that her $3 average weekly wage kept her household, comprising her mother and her 4 children, mired in poverty. a shop committee chair, Lewis told St. Louis Mayor Bernard F. Dickman that working women's low wages, not paid labor itself, made mothering difficult. Now, the strike leaders had joined forces with the Communist Party, which was quite the controversial move in this moment. They were espousing the need for workers to engage in collective action, and they persuasively kind of criticized liberal reformism and created new bridges to kind of think about economic justice and Black freedom together. They broke, in that period, in May of 1933, new ground for women's leadership, especially in terms of class struggle. So while the age of workers' rights struggles dawned unevenly and at different moments in cities and towns across the United States during the 1930s, in St. Louis, this moment begins when Cora Lewis and Carrie Smith lead a strike against their employer. Smith and Lewis were the women who played an integral role in formulating and shaping at the local level the basic understanding of what George Lipsitz calls the age of the CIO, or a social warrant, as he puts it, that, quote, took the form of a socially agreed upon understanding, certifying that working people deserved respect, dignity, and self-determination. So I'm using this understanding in my book less as a kind of marker for the work of a particular labor organization, and more as a kind of guiding ethos to describe how this concept really imbues working people's living concerns with political importance and social importance. That this is a way to kind of frame an era of significant political work developed by women like Lewis and Smith. Now, it was no small feat that Lewis, Smith, and the other women who joined them, that they won most of their demands, but their victory echoed deeper. Their political project kind of set the stage for a wage of struggle over the following 2 decades, one that prioritized economic dignity. So the book opens with the story of that May 1933 strike, and it ends with this one, a second major strike led by Black working class women that happened 36 years later. So not long after St. Louis has entered the year 1969, the final year of a decade of significant social upheaval at the local and national level, thousands of public housing tenants struck the St. Louis Housing Authority. Together, the Black working class women whose lives were at the center of the debate over the future of the city staged one of the earliest, largest, and costliest demonstrations of its kind. National news outlets provided coverage. Politicians at the local, state, and national level weighed in or amended policies as a result. And several strike leaders like Jean King emerged as national figures. Now, while they issued numerous demands to city officials to put a check kind of on rent, right? Make sure rent payments don't go too far, that don't increase too far, to deal with maintenance questions, kind of basic everyday concerns. Above all, the strikers were focused on issues related to dignity and control over their lives, you might say. They drew support from key leaders. They certainly drew a significant level of public sympathy. And they drew upon the kind of sustainable political communities that they had developed over time. They demanded a kind of redistribution of power, a greater allocation of resources to manage their own affairs. They wanted to become kind of key brokers at the table at this kind of decision-making, having an impact on the decision-making processes crucial to their everyday lives. So they win their demands after months of mobilization, and they helped to put St. Louis on the map, you might say, the proverbial map, as the site of transformative struggle. And they also made it possible for the St. Louis public housing system itself to emerge as a national exemplar of the tenant management model. But most importantly, however, by engaging in collective action to expose the connections between housing, employment, and working class residency in a declining, deindustrializing American city, undergoing sharp population loss and urban decline, these tenants who refused to pay rent cemented Black women's status as influential members of the city's working class. Women selected the strike method as their preferred political weapon of choice. They established close ties with influential city leaders, and they articulated their battle over public housing as a problem of lack of access to jobs. These elements not only reflected their political sophistication, but they also pointed to the legacy that I've been speaking of. So while some contemporaries understood or held the view that the rent strike was at best a kind of spontaneous or disorganized eruption of working class anger, you might say, with those in power, an accurate examination actually reveals that what transpired was the culmination of 3 decades of black working class women's economic activism and labor organizing. So in between, I tell the stories of domestic workers who have a similar kind of organizing struggle, the work of some youth who are trying to access new jobs, clerk jobs in the city, as well as the first kind of cohort of black women to integrate the city's garment factories in a rather kind of systematic way. So taken all together, these stories reflect this kind of tradition that I've been speaking of. Nutshellers, domestic workers in the 1930s, young women who were trying to kind of make their stance, you might say, in the city, defense workers of the March on Washington movement of the 1940s and the 1950s. They all made the varied dimensions of their economic lives and labors central to the ways that their contemporaries understood social justice, you might say. So as the gateway city or St. Louis underwent profound economic, political, and social transformations in this long 20th century, black women's activism indelibly marked the urban political agendas that shaped this local struggle. They forged an effective, community-based culture of activism that emphasized economic dignity, and they operated at the kind of intersection of struggles around economic justice, racial justice, the struggle for gender equity, and the like. And they incorporated a wide array of living concerns into their platforms, and even challenged kind of popular understandings of just who was the American working class. It really kind of exploded some of the myths embedded in that. So they contested boundaries marking struggles for racial and economic justice and found ways for political experimentation that won significant battles, you might say, in the 20th century. So the book is all about kind of bringing these struggles kind of into our consciousness, you might say, in a sense to kind of rewrite some of these histories that we're familiar with, but to do so from a very different kind of standpoint. So thank you.